When I was 8 months pregnant, my water suddenly broke during a family road trip. I was gasping in absolute agony. But instead of trying to save my life, my father started screaming at the top of his lungs, "You ruined my luxury SUV seats, and now the whole vehicle smells like a clinic. You are going to pay for this." He slammed on the brakes, violently dragged me out of the car, and left me completely abandoned and helpless on a dark, desolate highway. But they were all so blinded by their own arrogance that night. They had absolutely no idea that the very baby they left to die in the dark would become the exact reason they all wound up behind federal prison bars. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments and tell me what time it is there right now. It always amazes me to see how far these stories travel and how many people from around the world are joining me. My name is Scarlett. If you had told me a year ago that I would be sitting in a courtroom watching my own biological parents and younger brother handcuffed and dragged away to federal prison, I would have laughed in your face. I used to be the ultimate peacekeeper. I am a 26-year-old architectural designer, a profession that requires you to look at structural flaws and figure out how to reinforce them so everything doesn't collapse. I guess I spent my entire life trying to do that for my family too. I was raised in a traditional high-pressure household where my father's word was absolute law. My mother's main job was to police my compliance, and my brother was the golden child who could do no wrong. In our household, family loyalty wasn't a mutual bond. It was a one-way street where I did all the driving and they took all the credit. Then I met David. David is the complete opposite of the chaos I grew up in. He's a commercial airline pilot, grounded, calm, and incredibly protective of me. Because his family came from a modest working-class background, my parents instantly looked down on him. They thought he wasn't elite enough for our social circle. But to me, David was safety. He was the first person in my life who looked at me and didn't see an asset to be used, but a human being to be loved. We got married, bought a modest home, and a few months later, we found out I was pregnant. Because of some early complications, the doctors flagged my pregnancy as high risk. I needed rest, stability, and calm. David did everything he could to provide that, but his grueling international flight schedule frequently kept him away for days at a time, crossing time zones just to build up our savings for the baby. My family knew exactly how often David was away, and instead of stepping up to support me, they saw his absence as the perfect opportunity to reassert their control over me. They would call me at all hours demanding favors, treating my high-risk status like an annoying excuse I was making up for attention. I tolerated it because I was conditioned to. I kept telling myself that beneath their cold, materialistic exterior, they were still my blood. I believed that when the baby arrived, things would change. I genuinely believed that if a real crisis ever hit, my family would be the shield that protected me. I had no idea they were actually the monsters I needed protection from. To truly understand why that night on the highway happened, you have to understand the sick financial ecosystem of my family. My father, Arthur, owned a boutique corporate consulting firm in upstate New York. To the outside world, he was a brilliant self-made mogul. He wore tailored suits, drove the latest luxury cars, and walked around with an air of absolute superiority. But behind closed doors, Arthur's lifestyle was a fragile house of cards, built entirely on the backs of other people's labor, specifically mine. 2 years ago, Arthur's business hit a massive liquidity crisis. He had over-leveraged his assets, mismanaged his payroll, and banks wouldn't touch him. Instead of cutting back on his lifestyle, he came to me. I'll never forget the way he sat at my kitchen table, squeezing my hands with forced tears in his eyes, telling me that if I didn't help him, the family legacy would destroy itself. He begged me to co-sign a $15,000 corporate expansion loan using my pristine credit and the equity I had built up. He promised it was just a temporary formality, a safety net. Because I was a beautiful daughter, and because my mother Margaret spent 3 days on the phone guilt-tripping me about family honor, I signed the papers. I tied my financial throat to his sinking ship. But the sacrifices didn't stop at that $15,000 loan. When Arthur decided he needed a brand new cutting-edge corporate headquarters to impress high-end clients, he didn't hire an expensive architectural firm. He volunteered me for 8 brutal months while managing my own full-time job and dealing with the exhausting physical toll of my early pregnancy. I spent every single weekend drafting blueprints, managing zoning laws, and overriding design flaws for his new building. I did it all for free. Whenever I gently brought up the topic of compensation, or at least a partial repayment on the loan I co-signed, Arthur would wave his hand dismissively and say, "Don't be greedy, Scarlett. Everything I build will eventually belong to you and your brother anyway." That was the biggest lie of all. While I was bleeding my bank account and energy dry, my younger brother Robert was living like a king. Robert was 24, completely unemployed, and possessed the exact same toxic arrogance as my father. He spent his days drifting, partying, and driving a brand new $9,000 sports car that was leased directly through Arthur's business accounts that only existed because of my co-signed loan. Margaret constantly enabled him, bragging to her country club friends about how Robert was a free-spirited entrepreneur while treating me like an unpaid administrative assistant. I was the tireless, unseen engine keeping their entire social status afloat, pouring my sweat and credit score into their illusion of wealth. They took every dollar, every hour, and every ounce of my health, and in return, they treated me like an inconvenient asset whose only purpose was to serve them. I thought I was buying their love. In reality, I was just funding my own execution. The trap was sprung in late October. My father's firm had been selected to receive a highly publicized corporate achievement award at an ultra-exclusive black tie gala. The event was hosted at a luxury mountain resort deep in upstate New York, hours away from the city. To Arthur, this wasn't just a party. It was the crown jewel of his career. It was his chance to stand on a stage in front of hundreds of wealthy investors, politicians, and competitors to cement his status as an industry titan. And to pull off the illusion of the ultimate successful businessman, he needed his perfect family unit standing right beside him for the high society press photos. A week before the gala, I told my mother that I couldn't go. I was 8 months pregnant. My feet were severely swollen, and my doctor had explicitly warned me that the stress of long travel could trigger early labor. Margaret didn't care. She called me, screaming that my absence would make the family look fractured, fueling rumors that Arthur's business was unstable. When I stood my ground, Arthur took the phone. His voice was cold, laced with that familiar, terrifying manipulation. He reminded me about the $15,000 loan, hinting that if I didn't support him at this gala, he might just stop making the monthly payments, leaving my credit and my own home ruined. I was trapped. To make matters worse, David was thousands of miles away. He was piloting a long-haul commercial flight and got completely gridlocked at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago due to a massive unseasonal Midwestern storm system. Every single flight out was grounded. I called him from my bedroom, tears streaming down my face, telling him that my parents were forcing me to go. David was furious. He tried to call Arthur himself, but my father blocked his number. David managed to book himself on the very first morning flight out of Chicago, directly into upstate New York, promising me he would catch up to us at the resort by 8 a.m. the next day. "Just stay safe, Scarlett," he pleaded over the crackling phone line. "Don't let them push you." But they did. At 5 p.m. on the night of the gala, Arthur's brand new custom BMW Alpina B7 pulled into my driveway. Arthur was behind the wheel in a pristine, tailored tuxedo. Margaret was in the passenger seat dripping in expensive diamonds, and Robert was in the back scrolling through his phone in a designer suit. They didn't even come inside to help me with my bags. Robert rolled down his window and honked until I walked out. awkwardly carrying my heavy maternity dress. As soon as I climbed into the back seat, the tension was suffocating. The interior of the car smelled of rich, fresh, kneaded leather. Arthur had just spent $4,000 on a custom ivory-cold Italian leather upgrade. He kept adjusting his rearview mirror, boasting about how the press would love the car, how the investors would see him as a god. We hit Interstate 87 just as darkness fell, driving down a desolate, unlit stretch of the highway, surrounded by dense woods. 2 hours into the drive, the dull ache in my lower back suddenly sharpened. It wasn't the usual pregnancy discomfort. It felt like a hot iron wire was being twisted around my abdomen. I gasped, clutching my stomach, trying to breathe through it. Margaret looked back, scoffing. "Don't start with your drama tonight, Scarlett. We are an hour away from the resort, and we cannot be late." I tried to suppress it, but 20 minutes later, a violent, agonizing contraction ripped through my entire body. I let out a loud, involuntary shriek, grabbing the front headrest. And then I felt a terrifying, warm rush of fluid. My water had broken early and aggressively right there on the pristine ivory leather seats of Arthur's prized car. The moment the fluid soaked into the fabric, the atmosphere inside the car didn't turn into panic for my safety. It turned into absolute venomous rage. I was gasping, tears blinding my eyes as another wave of pain paralyzed my torso. But instead of looking for the nearest exit or calling 911, my father slammed his hands onto the steering wheel, causing the heavy vehicle to swerve violently across the dark lanes of Interstate 87. "What did you just do?" Arthur roared, his face turning an angry, distorted crimson in the glowing dashboard light. He adjusted the mirror, looking at the dark stains spreading across the ivory cushions. "Are you out of your mind? You just ruined my custom seats. That is $4,000 of neat Italian leather, permanently ruined by your disgusting carelessness. Dad, please." I sobbed, my voice cracking as I doubled over, my hands shaking against my stomach. "I'm in labor. It's too early. Something is wrong. Please, just take me to the nearest hospital. Put on the GPS. There has to be one near the next exit." "Oh, give me a break, Scarlett." Robert chimed in from beside me, sliding away toward the door to avoid touching me, looking at his designer suit with sheer disgust. "You're doing this on purpose. You've been trying to get out of this gala all week, and now you wait until we are on the grid to fake an emergency. Look at my shoes. If you get anything on my suit, I swear to God." My mother turned around in her seat, her eyes cold, devoid of any maternal instinct. "Margaret, tell him to stop the car," I begged, reaching out for her hand, but she pulled her arm away, adjusting her diamond necklace instead. "Scarlett, look at your father," she said, her voice dripping with chilly disapproval. "He has worked his entire life for this award tonight. The press is waiting. The governor's associates are waiting. We cannot show up to a black tie event with you smelling like a hospital room and your father's car smelling like a clinic. You are being incredibly selfish." "I am having a baby," I screamed, a brutal, blinding contraction ripping through my spine. I couldn't even sit upright anymore. I slid down into the footwell of the car, clutching my belly, terrified for the life of my unborn son. "Please, I am begging you. I'm your daughter." "Not anymore," Arthur growled. His voice had gone completely flat, a terrifying robotic calm taking over his anger. "I am not missing the defining moment of my career because you couldn't control yourself. I am not ruining my clothes, my car, and my reputation for your dramatic stunts." With a violent jerk of the wheel, he pulled the heavy SUV onto the gravel shoulder of the highway. The tires screeched against the rocks, bringing the car to a sudden halt on a completely unlit, desolate stretch of the road, surrounded by miles of dark forest. Before I could even realize what was happening, Robert opened the passenger door, the freezing late October wind rushing into the warm cabin. Arthur unbuckled his seatbelt, turned around, and grabbed my arm with an iron grip. He didn't handle me like a pregnant daughter. He handled me like a piece of garbage he was discarding. With a powerful, ruthless shove, he pushed me out of the open door. I tumbled onto the freezing sharp gravel of the highway shoulder, scraping my palms and knees against the rocks. "Call an Uber, or call your low-class husband," Arthur shouted over the roaring wind, his eyes dead as he looked down at me from the high seat. "Don't you dare track this mess back to our hotel."
Margaret didn't look at me. Robert slammed the door shut. Before I could even scream for help, Arthur hit the gas, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust and gravel that stung my face as the red taillights of his luxury car disappeared into the pitch-black night. I lay there on the frozen gravel of Interstate 87, a heavy cloud of exhaust fumes still hanging in the cold night air. The sharp stones dug into my scraped palms, and the freezing wind sliced through my thin maternity dress, but I barely felt the physical pain. Another massive, agonizing contraction ripped through my abdomen, bending my body in half. But as I buried my face in the dirt to muffle my screams, something inside me broke. It wasn't my spirit. It was the pathetic, desperate need I had always carried to please my family. The frantic, weeping daughter who had spent her entire life begging for Arthur's approval, trying to buy Margaret's affection and shielding Robert from his own failures. She died right there on that highway shoulder. In her place, a complete stranger stood up. The tears freezing on my cheeks felt like a ridiculous waste of energy. I looked down the long, empty stretch of unlit highway where my own flesh and blood had just abandoned me and my unborn child to die. All for the sake of a shiny crystal trophy and a clean leather seat. A cold, lethal clarity washed over me, numbing the terror. I realized that being kind, being dutiful, and keeping the peace had nearly cost me my life. My family didn't see me as a human being. They saw me as a transaction, an inconvenient line item to be erased the moment I became a burden. I anchored my bleeding hands into the dirt, pushed myself up to a seated position, and placed both hands over my tight, trembling belly. "We are going to survive this night," I whispered into the pitch black, my voice sounding completely unrecognizable to my own ears. It was steady, sharp, and empty of fear. "We are going to survive. And I am going to tear their entire world down to the ground. Every sacrifice I had ever made for them, every dollar of that $15,000 loan, every hour spent drafting blueprints, every login credential I possessed for Arthur's corporate accounts flashed through my mind. They thought they had left a defenseless victim in the dark. They had no idea they had just unlocked the cage of the one person who held the keys to their complete and total destruction. I didn't have to wait in the dark for long. 10 minutes after my family drove away, the blinding headlights of a New York State police cruiser illuminated the gravel shoulder. Officer Miller, a veteran state trooper on a routine night patrol, saw my silhouette against the trees and pulled over immediately, his red and blue emergency lights cutting through the pitch black. The moment he saw my condition, his professional calm shattered into urgent action. He didn't waste time waiting for an ambulance on that remote stretch of Interstate 87. He carefully lifted me into the front seat of his cruiser, radioed a Code 3 medical emergency to the dispatch, and tore down the highway toward Albany Medical Center with his sirens wailing. By 4 a.m., the hospital room was a blur of bright lights and medical staff. But the only face I cared about was David's. He had practically sprinted through the airport terminals the second his plane touched down, and he burst into the delivery room white-faced, trembling, and covered in sweat. He grabbed my hand, his eyes filling with tears, as he listened to me fight through the final stages of emergency labor. At exactly 4:42 a.m., our son, Leo, was born. Despite being a month premature, the doctors declared him completely healthy and stable. As I lay in the recovery bed, holding Leo against my chest, David sat beside me, his knuckles white, as he listened to me recount every single detail of what his family had done to me on that highway.
I watched the love in my husband's eyes turn into a cold, terrifying fury. He wanted to drive straight to the resort and confront Arthur with his bare hands, but I tightly squeezed his wrist. "No, David," I whispered, a dark smile touching my lips. "We aren't going to break the law. We are going to use it to erase them." While Arthur, Margaret, and Robert were sleeping off their champagne at the luxury resort, I began my work from the hospital bed. Officer Miller returned to my room with a detective, and I gave a comprehensive recorded criminal statement detailing the physical endangerment and abandonment. But that was just the fuse. I was about to drop the entire bomb. Because I had co-signed the $15,000 corporate expansion loan and spent months designing their new headquarters, I still possessed full administrative remote access to the digital financial back-end of Arthur's consulting firm. I opened my laptop, logged into their dual ledger accounting software, and downloaded 2 years of hidden financial files. I uncovered a massive systematic trail of federal tax fraud, fabricated business expenses, and embezzled corporate funds that Arthur and Robert had been using to fund their sports cars and country club lifestyles. I handed over the entire encrypted digital file directly to the forensic investigators and the New York State Police. To seal the trap, I called the bank and immediately froze the $15,000 co-signed credit line, cutting off their business liquidity instantly. By 8 a.m., the state troopers had already pulled the high-definition highway traffic camera footage, perfectly capturing the BMW Alpina B7 stopping on the shoulder, discarding me in the dirt, and speeding away. The trap was fully set. The final devastating blow fell at 11:30 a.m. in the grand gold leaf ballroom of the luxury mountain resort. Arthur was standing on the elevated stage, basking in the applause of 300 of the state's most influential business elites.
He was proudly holding his heavy crystal achievement trophy. Flanked by a beaming Margaret and a smug Robert, he stepped up to the microphone, cleared his throat, and began to speak about the foundational importance of impeccable integrity, corporate ethics, and strong family values. He didn't even finish his first sentence. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom flew open with a resounding bang. Officer Miller, accompanied by 4 New York State troopers and 2 plain-clothed federal investigators, marched straight down the center aisle toward the stage. The applause died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, bewildered silence. Arthur froze, his face turning ashen gray as the officers stepped right onto the stage, interrupting his presentation. Over the live house microphone echoing through the entire ballroom for every investor and competitor to hear. The lead detective read Arthur his Miranda rights. Arthur stammered, dropping his crystal trophy onto the stage floor where it shattered into 100 jagged pieces. Before he could even look away, the troopers grabbed his arms and slapped heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Margaret let out a piercing, hysterical shriek as an officer cuffed her too, while Robert desperately tried to back away, only to be shoved against the wall and handcuffed by a state trooper. They were marched down the center aisle in front of the flashing cameras of the high society press, stripped of every ounce of dignity they had spent their lives trying to buy. The legal system showed them the exact same mercy they showed me on that highway shoulder. None. Because the evidence was undeniable, the judge completely denied bail. Arthur was convicted of reckless endangerment, domestic abuse of a pregnant victim, and corporate tax fraud, receiving a 7-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. Robert and Margaret were sentenced to 3 years each for conspiracy and criminal failure to render aid to a person in imminent danger.
Arthur's business collapsed into instant bankruptcy. Their assets were seized, and their name became a permanent joke in the New York business community. Today, I sit in a sunlit nursery in our new home, completely free from the toxic shadows of the people who raised me. I look down at my healthy, laughing boy, Leo, safe in David's arms, and I feel a profound, unshakable peace. My biological family thought they could throw me out like trash to protect their perfect life. They had no idea that by leaving me in the dark, they gave me the perfect view to watch them burn. Looking back at that dark night on Interstate 87, I realized that some people are only family by blood, not by heart. They thought leaving me in the dark would destroy me, but it only forced me to find my own strength and protect my son. Karma works in calculated ways, and true justice isn't about anger, it's about boundaries. Now my life is filled with peace, and I want to ask you, do you think I did the right thing by turning them in, or would you have handled it differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you learned something valuable from my story, please subscribe and hit the bell icon.